Hello, and welcome to Veterans Voice. My name is Joe Armstrong. I'm the president of Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 1044, located in Sanford, Maine. Vietnam Veterans of America was founded in 1978 and is the only national Vietnam veterans organization congressionally chartered and dedicated to Vietnam-era veterans and their families. We are also dedicated to helping veterans and their families from all wars. Our founding principle is never again will one generation of veterans abandon another. On today's show, I want to talk to you about our Air Force brothers and sisters that flew aboard or worked on the C-123 aircraft that sprayed Agent Orange in Vietnam. The United States Air Force C-123 veterans flew the C-123 transport aircraft following use in Vietnam spraying Agent Orange. At this time, I would like to show you a short video that can explain this very, very important issue better than I can.
Can something from the Department of Veterans Affairs be called scientific if written solely to ensure a group of veterans is excluded from coverage? Can something be called scientific if researched only to give voice to the policy requirements of that agency, and not with an even-handed scientific attitude of, let's see where the evidence takes us? No, the VA didn't want to allow the C-123 veterans to qualify for Agent Orange exposure benefits, and the VA set out to write a few internet pages to give themselves a foundation for that injustice. In this instance, C-123 Air Force veterans find it difficult to understand the scientific review and investigation to which the VA refers in their various internet pages which deal with C-123 exposure, because those pages themselves provide very little detail, and our Freedom of Information Act request to the VA brought back only their curious response where the VA insists it has no documentation at all dealing with C-123 Agent Orange exposure. The VA even denied their own internet pages exist. Do you see how the question is raised? How can scientific review and investigation be done adequate to compel the VA to reach such a severe position as to deny C-123 veterans claims? And yet, the VA insists there are no documents, emails, marginal notes, presentations, publications, studies, investigations, reviews, letters, nothing at all on this subject. VA's public health and post-deployment health experts maintain that C-123 veterans weren't exposed to C-123 dioxin because there was no bioavailability. And yet the VA has no materials at all about C-123 bioavailability. How can VA claim to have dealt with this issue scientifically and yet bar peer review of their materials as well as review by the veterans? No, this wasn't science. It wasn't even voodoo science or weird science. It was straight policy. The VA has enough of these Agent Orange exposed veterans lined up for medical care and benefits to which they're entitled, by the way, and VA managers just clearly wanted to bring this to an end. But how? By pretending that no other veterans have been exposed, regardless of evidence to the contrary, and doing it by simply citing VA studies which are instead ill-disguised policy announcements. But let's look first into what can be found. The only sources are the VA's work on the internet, a few pages describing C-123 Agent Orange exposure, and some correspondence with veterans, with congressional representatives, and outside experts. So let's look at their internet pages. The basic one, basically the subject of this YouTube video, is titled Scientific Review of Agent Orange in C-123 Aircraft. Here, VA Office of Public Health experts claim to have reviewed existing scientific studies, and they say post-Vietnam War veterans flying the C-123 were unlikely to have been exposed at levels that would affect health. The first and most glaring issue here is that none of these studies which prove C-123 veterans might have been exposed are listed. Carefully, the VA selected or we should really say cherry-picked, only articles and studies they felt best destroyed the veteran's case. Ignored were countless juried articles, which we'll detail in a moment or two. Next, the VA attacked and dismissed the multitude of Air Force tests completed over the decades that described the dioxin of the C-123 fleet as heavily contaminated, as read one report, a danger to public health, read another. Even 29 years after their last Agent Orange spray missions, the airplanes stored out at the Air Force Desert Boneyard were still showing trace to low levels of dioxin contamination, for which any detectable levels are considered unsafe. Therefore, to minimize or dismiss the most relevant evidence for veterans' exposure, VA simply declared the Air Force test, completed, by the way, by both commercial expert firms and the military's own toxicologists, the VA declared them to have been done incorrectly in a manner that the tests themselves released dioxin not otherwise available to expose the crews. Dismissed was the fact that these tests were completed by highly reputable experts with doctorates in their field, and the tests were done using well-established standard procedure called Hexan swipes. In tests completed in the 2000-2009 timeframe, water wipes were also used with similar results, so the VA just chose to ignore those results. That would be better to focus then on the Hexan wipes, which were then dismissed to provide a basis for trashing all of the Air Force test results. Having then constructed such a huge barrier around the well-proven evidence, VA then turned to a claim to have consulted peer-reviewed literature. The first thing that stands out here is the age of some of these references, ranging between 10 and 30 years old. The next observation is the name Al Young popping up a couple times. Mr. Young is famous, I should say infamous, among Agent Orange victims for his career spent developing military applications for Agent Orange, and also infamous for his decades spent claiming Agent Orange is harmless to humans. Young's article cited by the VA was actually his claim that Vietnam veterans weren't exposed, but if they were, such exposure would have allowed very little bioavailability. This point, and the ones made subsequently in Young's article, form the basis grasped by the VA used to deny C-123 veterans' disability claims. Importantly, Young claims that actually no veterans in Vietnam were exposed or had bioavailability other than the air crews actually handling or having direct physical contact with liquid herbicide. Of course, the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine challenges this and challenges Young's position because it's not at all the generally accepted view among toxicologists and epidemiological scientists, but it provided the VA something to wave as its proof. Al Young is famous for another point of contact regarding C-123 veterans. In 2010, the Air Force needed to resolve storage concerns about dioxin-contaminated C-123s in storage. Young's advice was sought, and he recommended immediate destruction of the airplanes and reminded Air Force leaders that unless the destruction was done quietly, veterans might learn of their contamination and their exposure from the earlier years and then seek medical care, justifiably so, for their Agent Orange illnesses. And again, that important point, these veterans had already been exposed, and Young's official recommendation as the senior Agent Orange consultant to the Office of Secretary of Defense was that the Air Force quietly destroy the evidence before the C-123 victims, or should I say veterans, learned anything about it. Young's advice was repeated along the Air Force chain of command and provided the final solution for these toxic, aged warplanes in 2010. Young's advice was certainly not that of a neutral, independent observer in any of his activities. Referring to the C-123 veterans again, Young described them as trash haulers, freeloaders looking for a tax-free dollar from a sympathetic congressman. I have no respect for them, he wrote. C-123 veterans, most of whom saw combat, and indeed any scientist considering Young's writings, cannot accept any conclusions from this man who flaunts such a tainted perspective about which the veterans are involved. And what about the other references cited by the VA? veterans managed to locate Professor, now Emeritus Professor, L.W. Weber at Oregon State University. But Dr. Weber stated his study had nothing at all to contribute to the understanding of aircrew exposure. He asked that it not be used in that context. Another reference cited was written by Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who herself is famous in the field of dioxin research and is now Director, National Institutes of Health, NEIHS, and Director of the National Toxicology Program. Dr. Birnbaum, in recent years, reviewed the Air Force test results and other contemporary studies, such as Technical Guide 312 from the Department of Defense, and she concluded that the C-123 veterans actually were exposed. So that has left the VA citing Dr. Birnbaum's article to support their pretense that the veterans weren't exposed, but Dr. Birnbaum herself states that the veterans were exposed. The last element in the VA scientific review was the Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine C-123 consultative letter, which was released May of 2012. Here, the basic fact was that the Air Force disowned its own decades of testing and asserted that the C-123 crews were unlikely to have been exposed. This report has received very close scrutiny from scientists such as Dr. Birnbaum and others who fault it for the basic statement of unlikely exposure, and yet the Air Force also stated they didn't have enough information to draw any conclusion. So how could a conclusion be reached that the veterans weren't exposed when the Air Force admits not having enough data to make any conclusion at all? A paradox. Continuing examination of this consultative letter led to the Air Force Surgeon General stating that it must not be used or cited by the VA to deny benefits to any veteran. Challenges to the Air Force C-123 consultative letter continue from many corners, including the National Institutes of Health and even the Air Force. And it leaves the whole issue an embarrassment for the Air Force and for its earlier well-earned reputation, now trashed, for scientific integrity. Now, let's examine the errors of the VA's scientific review of Agent Orange and C-123 aircraft, point by point. It might be helpful here while watching this video to have first downloaded and printed the article. Easily Googled, just use the title. First, they write, may be detected by sophisticated laboratory techniques many years after its use. How deceptive. VA implies here sophisticated equipment is necessary to detect dioxin on these airplanes, and yet standard equipment by qualified technicians, that's all that's required, and that's exactly what was done over the decades in which C-123s consistently tested positive and heavily contaminated with Agent Orange. VA was also deceptive in using the word may, when in fact the proper word should be was. May in scientific reports implies only a possibility or a vagueness or a basic less likely to than not. But the actual record of C-123 Agent Orange exposure reads was detected. And residual TCDD, as they write, regardless of being residual or whatever was meant by that phrase, is indeed still TCDD. Finally, VA states that the available reports and studies lead their own public health officials to conclude there was a low probability of exposure. Well, this was their objective when they set out to write the report, and thus they concluded. Clearly, VA spent much more time with their own clever wording of their internet pages than they did actually studying the potential, giving fair weight to the victims' claims here of C-123 exposure. The next point in the VA sheet is they're writing unlikely to have occurred at any levels that could affect health. Here they have no foundation for the statement other than Young's tainted views. In fact, other federal agencies such as the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry and the National Toxicology Program and the U.S. Public Health Service all opine that C-123 veterans' health was affected. ATSDR even states these veterans have a 200-fold greater cancer risk than the screening value. And in any case, the 1991 Agent Orange Act and other requirements of law only read exposed, with no mention of levels, flavors, colors, kinds, bioavailability, nothing mentioned other than a statutory requirement, reasonably so, that a veteran establish exposure. And here the VA agrees that inhalation of dust particles to which dioxin has become bound is at least a low probability. But other scientists maintain it to be a very high probability instead, because dioxin binds readily to dust particles. Next, regarding routes of exposure, veterans claim dermal, inhalation, and ingestion routes to have happened. VA dismissed inhalation of TCDD as an aerosol, and yet dioxin binds readily to dust, which was ever present. VA dismissed dermal exposure, and yet there's ample scientific agreement for the skin being a likely route, and both the Army and Air Force used dermal exposure models. Here the VA uses more deceptive wording, stating that a solvent, hexan, was required to dislodge the dioxin in tested airplanes. In fact, hexan is the standard wipe test used in all such situations. For instance, it would be used today at Walmart, at the post office, the local high school, in any other setting where a surface contaminant needed to be studied. Further, testing by the Air Force and contracted laboratories that know what they're doing between 2000 and 2009 used both hexan and water swipes with similar results, all confirming the dioxin presence. The VA claims on the next point that it will continue to review new findings relevant to this issue as they become available. Many indeed have become available, including expert opinions confirming C-123 veterans exposure from a large number of other agencies, universities, independent medical, and scientific experts, all ignored by the VA, or as recently happened in Manchester, New Hampshire, grouped by the VA in what they call unacceptable lay evidence. Well, unacceptable lay evidence includes the following. Dr. Jeannie Stellman, Professor Emerita of the Mailman School of Public Health, Columbia University, veterans were exposed. Dr. Fred Berman, Director of the Toxicology Program, Oregon Health Sciences University, veterans were exposed. Dr. Aubrey Miller, U.S. Public Health Service, Senior Medical Advisor to the National Toxicology Program, veterans were exposed. Dr. Arnold Schlechter, Professor of Medicine at the University of Texas Medical School, veterans were exposed. Dr. Linda Birnbaum, Director of the National Toxicology Program and Director of the National Institutes of Health, NEIHS, veterans were exposed. Dr. Christopher Portier, Director, CDC Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, veterans were exposed. Dr. Wayne Dworchak, Chief Scientist Emeritus of the Hatfield Group of Environmental Consultants, veterans were exposed. The EPA, we concur with ATSDR, veterans were exposed. Well, it strikes the observer here that so many conclude veterans have been exposed. None of the agencies mentioned have policies about exposure one way or another, and none of the persons providing opinions here was paid to do so, unlike the VA staff paid to construct their barrier to veterans' claims. But there's more, much more. In other internet pages about the C-123, VA claims to have thoroughly reviewed all available scientific information. Ignored, however, were all opinions, findings, and other documents which may have supported the veteran's claim for exposure, such as the Standard Guide for Surface Contamination, TG 312, considered the gold standard in this field. Other experts using that TG 312 conclude that C-123 veterans were indeed exposed. Ignored also was the CDC Bulletin, Concurrent Intelligence Bulletin 40. Perhaps the VA, eager to prove C-123 veterans could not have been exposed via dermal routes, or at least to try to construct an argument that, regardless of the logic, suggested they were not exposed. Well, perhaps the VA did not favor the CDC observation that exposure was possible by simple contact, or the CDC observation that both water and hexan wipes are appropriate surface testing procedures. Nope, the CDC bulletin did nothing to support the VA position, everything to support the veterans, and so the authors of a scientific review felt it best to be ignored. Totally ignored, not mentioned at all as a cited work because it didn't bear against the veterans. Google Scholar and many other internet resources provide more than enough support for the C-123 veterans' claims for Agent Orange exposure, so the VA didn't cite them. In particular, to make sure dermal exposure was eliminated as a route of dioxin harming the veterans, even though most peer-reviewed articles such as Dioxin's Toxicological Overview emphasize the dangers of inhalation, ingestion, and dermal exposure. The VA simply ignored it. Again, if it didn't support their argument, they ignored it. Further, but totally ignored by the VA writers, dioxin articles frequently stress the fact that dioxin accumulates over time, and long-term exposure is more harmful than short-term because the body can't rid itself of the dioxin buildup fast enough before the dioxin is reintroduced by re-exposure. Why is this important to C-123 veterans? Because they flew the C-123 for 10 years. Not only flew it, but ate in it, repaired it, loaded and unloaded, slept aboard during tactical deployments. Hey, so much more comfortable than an Army tent alongside a runway. The veterans were exposed and re-exposed for a full decade. In November of 2012, 16 concerned scientists and physicians joined Dr. Jeannie Stellman of Columbia University in bringing their professional concerns about the scientific basis, or lack of it, for VA decisions regarding C-123 veterans exposure to Agent Orange. The scientists explained their problems with the VA approach, which denied dermal absorption because dermal exposure to dioxin is well proven, and indeed skin absorption is a primary occupational route of exposure. In general, this respected group dismissed the entire VA policy prohibiting C-123 veterans exposure claims. Unfortunately, wrote the scientists, the VA Public Health Office in turn bases its conclusion on several erroneous assumptions about routes of entry of dioxin to the body, as well as other scientific misapprehensions. We have carefully examined scientific review of Agent Orange and C-123 aircraft and find it seriously flawed. We feel obligated to point out the scientific shortcomings in the VA appraisal. Mr. Thomas Murphy of the VA's Compensation Service rebuffed their letter. Noted for his own denial of a C-123 veteran's Agent Orange claim because, as Mr. Murphy wrote, no long-term harm has been shown to be caused by Agent Orange. The scientists were told that the VA would stand by its C-123 position regardless of any scientist, any university, any government, or any independent expert that says otherwise. Clearly, however, C-123 veterans have established the validity of their Agent Orange claims to the satisfaction of the medical and scientific communities, and to the satisfaction of other federal agencies as well, including those with the statutory responsibility for making the call about exposure, such as the ATSDR. C-123 veterans earned combat pay for going in harm's way with their airplanes over the decades they flew for the Air Force, but they didn't know they should have also demanded Agent Orange exposure pay for that hazard for the years they flew aboard the toxic C-123. A hard copy of this discussion can be downloaded at c123kcancer.blogspot.com, including hot links to all the cited references. C-123 veterans don't need any new laws, no new regulations, because they're fully qualified to receive VA medical care under the 1991 Agent Orange Act, various CFRs, and in particular the 8 May 2001 Federal Register, in which the VA guarantees that non-Vietnam veterans who were exposed to military herbicides will be treated the same as Vietnam veterans. The veterans need your help. Your senators and congressional representatives need to contact Mr. Brooks Tucker of Senator Burr's staff. Senator Burr himself has taken the lead on this bicameral and bipartisan effort. Ask your representatives to join with Mr. Tucker, who does the hard work. Ask them to insist that the VA honor their veterans who need only one thing from the VA, and that is that it follow the law.
Welcome back. Since the publishing of the information that has been shown in the video, a lot has taken place. On June 18, 2015, the VA released a press release entitled VA Expands Disability Benefits for Air Force Personnel Exposed to Contaminated C-123 Aircraft. The Department of Veterans Affairs, or the VA, today published a new regulation that expands eligibility for some benefits for a select group of Air Force veterans and Air Force Reserve personnel who were exposed to herbicides of Agent Orange through regular and repeated contact with contaminated C-123 aircraft that had been used in Vietnam as part of Operation Ranch Hand, or ORH. The VA published this regulation as an interim final rule so that it could immediately begin providing benefits to eligible Air Force veterans and Air Force Reserve personnel who submitted a disability claim for any of the 14 medical conditions that have been determined by the VA to be related to exposure to Agent Orange. I want to add a little to that. It says 14. Now those 14 illnesses are what they call presumptive or primary. The true number is 62. The rest of the illnesses and diseases are what they call secondary. Either way, you're eligible for compensation. Secretary of Veterans Affairs Robert A. McDonald made the decision to expand benefits following receipt of a 2015 Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, IOM, on post-Vietnam dioxin exposure in Agent Orange contaminated C-123s. This VA requested report found evidence that as many as 1,500 to 2,100 U.S. Air Force and U.S. Air Force Reserve personnel who served as flight, medical, or ground maintenance crew members on OR-2C-123 aircraft previously used to spray Agent Orange in Vietnam, that they were exposed to the herbicides. Opening up eligibility for this deserving group of Air Force veterans and reservists is the right thing to do, said Secretary McDonald. We thank the IOM for its thorough review that provided the supporting evidence needed to ensure we can now fully compensate any former crew member who develops an Agent Orange-related disability. Under this new rule, Air Force and Air Force Reserve flight, medical, and ground maintenance crew members who served on the contaminated ORH C-123s are presumed to have been exposed to herbicides during their service, thus making it easier for them to establish entitlement for some VA benefits if they develop an Agent Orange-related presumptive condition. In addition, for affected Air Force Reserve crew members, the VA will presume that their Agent Orange-related condition had its onset during their reserve training. This change ensures that these reservists are eligible for VA disability compensation and medical care for any Agent Orange-related presumptive condition, and that their surviving dependents are eligible for dependency and indemnity compensation and burial benefits. The interim final rule can be found on the Federal Register at www.federalregister.sov/public/inspection. The VA will immediately begin processing claims and issuing benefits to eligible Air Force crew and Air Force Reserve crew members. The VA encourages reservists who are assigned to flight, ground, or medical crew duties at Lockbourne, Rickenbacker Air Force Base in Ohio, 906th and 907th Tactical Air Group, or the 355th and 356th Tactical Airlift Squadron, Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, 731st Tactical Air Squadron, and the 74th Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania International Airport, 758th Airlift Squadron during the period of 1969 through 1986, and developed an Agent Orange-related disability to file a disability compensation claim online through the joint VA Department of Defense website portal, e-benefits, at www.benefits.va.gov /compensation/Agent Orange-C123.ASP. The VA also has identified several active duty locations where OR-2 C-123 aircraft may have been used following their service in Vietnam. Active duty personnel who served in a regular United States Air Force unit location where a contaminated C-123 was assigned and who had regular and repeated contact with the aircraft through flight, ground, or medical duties during the period of 1969 to 1986, and who developed an Agent Orange-related disability, also are encouraged to apply for benefits. For more information on applying for these benefits, including the affected units, Air Force specialty codes, and dates of service for affected crew members, and a listing of the Agent Orange-related conditions, visit www.benefits.va.gov/compensation/Agent Orange-C123.ASP. In order to avoid unnecessary delay of benefits, claimants should anoint C-123 after each Agent Orange-related disability in Part 2, Block 14 of the VA Form 21-526, or Section 1, Block 2 of the VA Form 21-526EZ when filing for e-benefits. An example would be diabetes C-123. If claimants have any of the following documents, they should be attached to their application: discharge separation papers, or a DD-214 or equivalent, United States Air Force Form 2096, unit were assigned at the time of training action, U.S. Air Force Form 5, aircraft flight duties, U.S. Air Force Form 781, aircraft maintenance duties, dependency records, marriage and children's birth certificates, medical evidence, doctors and hospital reports. The VA will process all claims related to C-123 exposure at the St. Paul, Minnesota VA Regional Office. Claims not filed through e-benefits should be mailed to the following address or faxed to area code 508-373-6694, or mailed to the Department of Veterans Affairs, Claims Intake Center, Attention C-123 Claims, P.O. Box 5088, Jennysville, Wisconsin, 53547-5088. Individuals with specific benefit questions related to herbicide exposure on C-123s may call VA Special 123 hotline at 1-800-749-8387. That's available 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Or you can email yscc123.vavbaspl@va.gov. I know it's a lot to digest right now, so if you'd like a printed copy of what we have discussed here today, or any of our shows, please email me at president@vva1044maine.org with your mailing address, and I will send you a copy. Thank you for watching The Veteran's Voice. I'm Joe Armstrong. Until the next time, don't give up the good fight. Thank you.